He yelled, "Get out, you're done," so loud that every phone in that glass conference room stopped ringing at once, and 30 pairs of eyes turned to watch a grown man scream at a 26-year-old woman over 3 ounces of spilled coffee. My hands were shaking so badly that when I dropped to my knees to wipe the floor with the sleeve of my only good blazer, the fabric slid up my left arm, and that was the moment Desmond Calloway stopped shouting mid-sentence. I watched the color drain out of his face like someone had pulled a plug somewhere behind his eyes, and he whispered a question that made no sense to me at the time. "Where did you get that?" I did not know that scar was about to unravel 25 years of lies, or that the man firing me for spilling his coffee was about to become the reason I finally understood why I never looked like anyone in my own family. My name is Odessa Marsh, and before that morning I was nobody special, just another temp worker inside Callaway Vance Holdings, the kind of employee whose name executives never bothered to learn because they assumed I would be gone within the year like all the others. I want to tell you everything, not just the part where he screamed at me, because you need to understand who I was before that day so you can understand who I became after it. I grew up in Gastonia, North Carolina, in a small brick house that always smelled like fried onions and old carpet, raised by a woman named Patris Marsh, who I called Mama my entire life, and a man named Curtis Marsh who worked third shift at a textile plant until his knees gave out. They were good people. They were not rich people. They never lied to me about being poor, but they lied to me about something much bigger, and I did not find that out until I was 26 years old, standing on my knees in a conference room, wiping coffee off imported Italian marble. I was the only child in that house who did not look like anyone else in the family photographs. My cousins used to joke about it at Thanksgiving, asking Mama if the hospital had switched babies on her, and she always laughed it off in that tight way adults laugh when a joke lands closer to a truth than they want you to know. I had pale hazel eyes in a family of deep brown ones. My hair curled in loose waves instead of the tight coils everyone else had. And on my left wrist, just below the base of my palm, I carried a scar shaped like a thin crescent moon, silver white against my skin, the kind of scar that does not come from a kitchen accident or a fall off a bike. Mama told me I got it as a baby, from a car accident before she and Curtis adopted me, and that the records from that time were incomplete because the agency handling my case had closed down years before I was old enough to ask questions. I stopped asking after a while because every time I brought it up, something flickered across her face that looked a lot like fear, and I loved her too much to keep hurting her with questions she could not answer. I moved to Charlotte 4 years before all of this happened, chasing a business degree I never finished because Curtis got sick and the money had to go somewhere real. I picked up temp work through a staffing agency, cleaning offices in the evenings and filing paperwork during the day, anything that paid on time. Callaway Vance Holdings hired me through that same agency 8 months before the coffee incident, placing me as a junior administrative assistant on the 14th floor, one level below the executive suite where Desmond Calloway ran his empire of logistics companies and commercial real estate. I barely ever saw him in person. He was the kind of man who existed more as a name on letterhead than an actual human being who walked hallways, a tall figure in tailored charcoal suits, who moved through the building surrounded by assistants the way a storm moves surrounded by wind. People talked about him in hushed, careful tones, not out of love, but out of the specific respect reserved for men who could end your career with a single sentence. I should tell you a little more about what it felt like to work inside a building like that, invisible in the specific way that service staff become invisible to the people they serve every day. I used to ride the elevator up to the 14th floor at 7:15 every morning, always before the executives arrived, because the staffing agency had trained us to be a kind of quiet furniture that appeared and disappeared without ever drawing attention to itself. I knew the names of every executive assistant on that floor, knew which partners liked their coffee black and which ones wanted oat milk stirred in exactly twice, knew the birthdays of receptionists I had spoken to maybe a dozen times in 8 months. Nobody on the executive floor knew my last name. Some of them did not know my first name either, and called me the temp, the way you might refer to a piece of office equipment that had recently been installed. I did not resent it, not really, Because I understood the arrangement I had entered into the moment I accepted that assignment. I was there to be useful and unnoticed, and for a woman trying to save enough money to finish a business degree and help Curtis with his medical bills, useful and unnoticed was a fair trade for a steady paycheck. I had actually seen Desmond Calloway in person only 3 times before that Tuesday, always from a distance, always moving quickly between his office and the elevator bank, with 2 assistants trailing behind him like satellites caught in his orbit. He had a reputation inside that building that people discussed only in lowered voices near the coffee station, stories about deals he had closed through sheer force of will, about junior employees who had made small mistakes and found themselves without a job by the end of the day, about the particular coldness he was known to show anyone who embarrassed him in front of investors or the press. I remember a woman named Terrell, who worked reception on the 12th floor, telling me during a lunch break that Desmond Calloway had once fired an entire catering company on the spot because the shrimp had been served 2 degrees too warm during a board dinner. I laughed about it at the time, the way you laugh about wealthy men behaving like small tyrants in stories that always sound a little exaggerated in the retelling. I did not think, even for a second, that I would become the next story people whispered about near that same coffee station. The morning everything changed started like any other Tuesday. I had been asked, at the last minute, to help serve coffee during a high-stakes investor meeting because the executive assistant who normally handled it had called in sick. I remember standing outside the glass conference room at 8:47 in the morning, holding a silver tray with 6 porcelain cups, my heart hammering because I had never been inside that room before, only past it, watching through the glass the way you watch a museum exhibit you are not allowed to touch. Desmond Calloway sat at the head of the table in a navy suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent, flanked by investors from a firm called Ashgrove Capital, who were deciding whether to fund the largest acquisition of his career. A deal worth close to $400 million, according to the whispers that had traveled through the building for weeks. The tension in that room was so thick I could feel it against my skin before I even opened the door. I moved around the table quietly, setting cups down exactly the way I had been instructed, working from the far end toward Desmond's seat at the head of the table, trying to be invisible the way service staff are trained to be in rooms like that. Everything was going fine until one of the investors, a heavyset man named Roland Pierce, shifted his chair back sharply without warning just as I leaned in to place his cup, and the tray tilted, and 3 ounces of scalding coffee splashed across the edge of the table and down the sleeve of Desmond Calloway's suit jacket. The room went silent in that particular way that only happens right before something terrible. I froze, the empty tray shaking in my hands, watching a dark stain spread across $4,000 of fabric, while 6 investors stared at me like I had just set the building on fire. Desmond stood up so fast his chair rolled backward and hit the wall behind him, and the sound of it seemed to echo far longer than it should have. His face had gone a deep, furious red, the kind of red that comes from years of controlling every variable in your life only to have a stranger ruin the one moment that mattered most. "Are you serious right now?" he said, his voice low and dangerous in a way that scared me more than shouting would have. I started apologizing immediately, grabbing napkins from the tray, trying to blot the stain before it set, but he stepped back from me so fast he nearly knocked over another chair. "Do not touch me," he snapped, and then his voice rose into something that filled the entire glass room and probably carried into the hallway beyond it. "Do you have any idea what is happening in this room? Do you have any idea what $400 million sounds like when it walks out that door because some clumsy girl cannot carry a tray straight? Get out. You're done. Pack your things and get out of my building." I stood there for a moment that felt like it stretched into an entire lifetime, humiliation burning up my neck and into my face, while 6 strangers in expensive suits watched a man twice my age scream at me over an accident that was not even fully my fault. Roland Pierce, the investor who had shifted his chair, said nothing, did not correct the record, did not tell his colleague that the fault was partly his own for moving without warning. Nobody in that room was going to defend me, because defending me would have meant contradicting the man whose signature they needed on paperwork worth a fortune. I understood that instantly the way you understand cold water the moment it touches your skin. So I did the only thing I could do. I dropped to my knees and began wiping the spilled coffee off the marble floor with the sleeve of my blazer. Because some old instinct in me, some instinct built by watching Mama clean other people's houses for extra money when I was a child, told me that finishing the job with dignity mattered more than fighting a battle I could not win. It was in that motion, kneeling and reaching forward to catch the last of the spill before it ran under the table, that my sleeve rode up my left arm and exposed my wrist to the room. I did not think anything of it. I had stopped thinking about that scar as anything unusual years earlier, the way you stop noticing a scar you have carried your entire life. But Desmond Calloway noticed. I heard his voice die in his throat mid-word, the sentence he had been building toward collapsing into silence. When I looked up, he was staring at my wrist the way a man stares at something he has spent 25 years convincing himself he would never see again. His face, which seconds earlier had been flushed with anger, went the color of old paper. His hand actually reached toward me and then stopped in the air, trembling, like he was afraid that touching me would prove the impossible was real. "Where did you get that?" he asked, and his voice had changed completely, all the fury drained out of it, replaced by something that sounded almost like fear. I pulled my sleeve down instinctively, embarrassed, assuming he was somehow disgusted by the scar, the way strangers sometimes stared at it when I was a child. "It's just an old scar," I said quietly. "I've had it since I was a baby." "Since you were a baby," he repeated, and his eyes had not moved from my wrist even after I covered it. "Show it to me again." The investors around the table exchanged glances, clearly as confused as I was, and Roland Pierce actually laughed a short, uncomfortable laugh, the kind men use to fill silence they do not understand. "Desmond, what on earth?" he started, but Desmond held up a hand without even looking at him, an instruction so absolute that Roland stopped talking immediately despite being the man whose money the entire meeting depended on. I hesitated, but something in Desmond's face, some desperate, unguarded thing I had never seen on an executive before, made me push my sleeve back up and hold my wrist out toward him. He crossed the room in 3 steps, kneeling down in front of me the way I had knelt to clean his floor, a billionaire in a ruined suit crouching on marble in front of a temp worker he had just fired, staring at a thin crescent-shaped scar like it was the only thing in the world that existed. His hand hovered over my skin without touching it, and when he finally spoke again, his voice cracked in a way that made the entire room go still. "That scar," he said, "that exact shape. I have seen that scar exactly once before in my life." Nobody in that room understood what was happening, including me. I sat frozen on the marble floor while a man who had just fired me stared at my wrist like he had seen a ghost, and somewhere underneath my confusion, a small, cold feeling began to spread through my chest, the feeling you get right before your entire life rearranges itself around a truth you were never given the chance to prepare for. Desmond stood up slowly, running a hand through his hair, and turned to the investors with an expression I can only describe as a man trying to hold 2 separate realities together at once. "I need this meeting rescheduled," he said, his voice regaining some control but still unsteady underneath. Roland Pierce started to protest about schedules and deadlines, but Desmond cut him off with a sharpness that silenced the room completely. "Reschedule it, Roland. Something has come up that is more important than $400 million, and if you cannot understand that, we were never going to be good partners anyway." The investors left in stunned silence, gathering their folders and phones, throwing confused glances back at me as they filed out of the glass room. When the door finally closed behind the last of them, it was just Desmond and me, standing in a conference room that still smelled like spilled coffee, the tray forgotten on the table between us. He did not sit down in his chair at the head of the table. Instead, he pulled out the chair across from mine and sat facing me directly, his hands folded so tightly together I could see his knuckles whiten. "I need to ask you some questions," he said, "and I need you to understand that I am not asking as your employer anymore. I fired you 5 minutes ago, and I am asking you to forget that I did, because none of that matters right now." I should have been angry. Any reasonable person would H. Ave walked out of that building the moment he apologized, filed a complaint with the staffing agency, and never looked back. But there was something in his eyes, something raw and unguarded that made me stay in that chair. Ask me what you need to ask, I said. How old are you? He said. 26. Your birthday, what is your exact birthday? March the 14th. Something moved behind his eyes, a calculation, a piece falling into place. Where were you born? He asked. Do you know? I was adopted, I said. My parents never had the full records. They told me the agency that handled my adoption closed down not long after, and most of the paperwork was lost in some kind of fire at their storage facility. I know I was adopted as an infant, maybe 6 or 7 months old. That's really all I have. Desmond closed his eyes for a long moment, and when he opened them again, they were wet in a way that made my chest tighten with an emotion I could not name. 25 years ago, he said slowly, I had a wife named Vivian, and we had a daughter together. Her name was Iris. She was 7 months old when they were both killed in a car accident on the interstate outside of Asheville, driving home from Vivian's sister's house on a rainy October night. I identified Vivian's body myself. Iris's body was never recovered in a condition that allowed for a traditional identification. I was told the fire that started after the crash made that impossible. I buried an empty casket for my daughter, because that is what the medical examiner and the insurance investigators told me I had to accept. I sat completely still, listening to a man describe the worst night of his life in a voice that had gone hollow with old grief, and I did not yet understand why he was telling me any of it. Iris had a scar, he continued, from a surgery she underwent at 6 weeks old to correct a minor vascular issue in her wrist that the doctors caught during a routine checkup. The surgeon told us it would heal into a fine line, curved, crescent-shaped, right at the base of her left palm. I used to hold that tiny wrist in my hand every night when I fed her, tracing that scar with my thumb while she fell asleep. I have never in 25 years seen another scar shaped exactly like that one. Not once, until 5 minutes ago when your sleeve slipped. The room seemed to tilt around me. I gripped the edge of the table to steady myself, my mind racing through 100 impossible explanations, searching for any way this could be a coincidence, a strange trick of biology, anything other than what his face was silently begging me to consider. That's not possible, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. My parents adopted me. There would be records. Someone would have known. Someone did know, Desmond said, and something hardened in his voice, something that sounded like the beginning of an anger far more dangerous than the anger he had shown me over the coffee. Somebody knew exactly what happened that night, and I intend to find out who. He asked if I would be willing to take a DNA test, and I said yes before I had even fully processed the question, because some part of me, some part that had spent 26 years staring at a scar nobody could explain, already knew what the answer would be. He arranged everything within the hour. A private clinic across town, a technician who was sworn to confidentiality and paid enough to guarantee it. And as we sat together in the waiting room afterward, 2 strangers bound by a single unexplainable shape of skin, he told me about Vivian, about the daughter he had mourned for 25 years, about the guilt that had eaten through every corner of his life since that October night on a rain-slicked interstate. He told me that after the accident, he had thrown himself into building Callaway Vance Holdings from a single logistics company into an empire spanning 4 states, not out of ambition, but because grief needed somewhere to go and work was the only container large enough to hold it. He told me he had never remarried, never had another child, because some part of him believed he did not deserve a second chance at the family he had failed to protect. He told me that Vivian's younger sister, a woman named Sabrina Whitlow, had been the one to identify what remained of the wreckage, the one who handled most of the arrangements in the days after the accident because Desmond had been too broken to function, and that he had never once questioned anything she told him because grief does not leave room for suspicion. The results came back 9 days later, on a Thursday afternoon in early spring, delivered not by mail but in person by the clinic director herself, because Desmond had paid for that level of urgency and discretion. I sat in his office on the top floor of Callaway Tower, a room I had never once been inside during my 8 months of employment, watching his hands shake as he opened the sealed envelope. He read the results twice before he spoke, and when he finally looked up at me, there were tears running freely down a face that the business world believed was incapable of that kind of emotion. "You're my daughter," he said. "You are Iris. You survived that accident, and somebody made the entire world believe you did not." I do not have adequate words for what that moment felt like, hearing a stranger call me by a name I had never owned, a name that belonged to a version of myself I never knew existed. I thought of Mama and Curtis, of every Thanksgiving joke about hospital mix-ups that had turned out to carry more truth than any of us understood, and a grief entirely separate from Desmond's grief opened up inside me. Grief for the parents who had raised me on second-hand furniture and love they never rationed. Parents who I now understood must have known, or at least suspected, something about where I truly came from. I confronted Mama that same evening, driving the 2 hours back to Gastonia with my hands trembling on the steering wheel the entire way. She was sitting on the porch when I arrived, and something in my face must have told her everything before I said a single word, because she stood up so fast her rocking chair slammed against the porch railing behind her. "Odessa," she said, and her voice already carried the sound of a confession. I told her what I had learned, watched her face crumple into something between relief and terror, 26 years of held breath finally released. She told me the truth that night, sitting together on that same porch, until the streetlights flickered on and the crickets filled the silence between her sentences. She and Curtis had adopted me through a private arrangement facilitated by a woman they knew only as an intermediary, paying a significant fee that Curtis had borrowed against his pension to cover, because they had been trying to have a child for 6 years, and the traditional adoption agencies kept turning them away over their income. They were told I had been surrendered voluntarily by a young mother who could not care for me, that all the proper paperwork existed but was sealed for my protection. And they had been so desperate for a child, so in love with me the moment they held me, that they had chosen not to ask the kind of hard questions that might have unraveled the arrangement. Mama wept as she told me this, apologizing over and over, and I held her hands and told her that nothing about her love for me had ever been a lie, even if the circumstances that brought us together were built on one. That part, at least, I believed completely, and I still do. Desmond hired private investigators the moment I told him what Mama had shared, men who specialized in exactly this kind of unraveling, and within 3 weeks they had traced the intermediary back to a woman who had worked, briefly, as an administrator inside the same hospital where Vivian and I had been treated after the accident. That woman, it turned out, had been paid a substantial sum by someone close to the family to falsify records and arrange a quiet, off-the-books adoption for a surviving infant who was never supposed to survive the official story of that October night. It took another 2 weeks of digging, subpoenas, and one very tense meeting inside a lawyer's office in Asheville before the investigators confirmed exactly who had made that payment. Sabrina Whitlow, Vivian's own sister. The woman who had identified the wreckage, who had handled every arrangement in those first devastating days, who Desmond had trusted completely, because trusting her required nothing of the suspicion that grief refuses to hold. The reason unraveled slowly, painfully, over the following months as the investigation deepened into Vivian's estate and the trust structures her family had established years before the accident. Vivian had come from old money, a trust fund controlled through a complicated set of provisions that specified how her share of the family estate would be divided if she died without a surviving child, versus how it would be divided if she died with one. If Iris had been declared dead alongside her mother that October night, the entirety of Vivian's trust would pass, according to those provisions, directly to Sabrina and her own 2 children. If Iris had survived, that trust would instead remain locked in guardianship for the child until she came of age, with Desmond serving as trustee, and Sabrina would inherit nothing beyond what she was already entitled to. Somewhere in the chaos of that crash site, in the confusion of a fire and a rain-soaked interstate, and a family too devastated to ask hard questions, Sabrina Whitlow had made a choice that turned her niece into a line item in an inheritance calculation. She had paid the hospital administrator to falsify my status, to list me among the deceased, and to quietly arrange my transfer into an adoption pipeline. Far outside the official system, ensuring no records would ever connect me back to the Calloway or the Whitlow name. She had let her sister's husband bury an empty casket and spend 25 years believing his daughter had died screaming in a burning car, and she had done it not out of hatred, but out of the much simpler and far uglier motivation of money. When Desmond confronted her directly, in a meeting I chose to attend because I needed to see her face when the truth was finally spoken aloud, she did not deny it the way I expected her to. She sat across from us in a lawyer's conference room that felt eerily similar to the one where all of this had begun, and she said only, "I never thought either of you would find out." I told myself it was better this way, that the money would help my children more than a division of an estate you could barely remember owning. There was no real remorse in her voice, only the calculated disappointment of someone whose careful plan had finally collapsed after a quarter-century of holding. The legal consequences moved slowly but decisively over the following year. Sabrina Whitlow was charged with fraud, falsification of records, and obstruction related to the concealment of a surviving minor, charges that carried real prison time once the prosecutors finished building their case with the mountain of documentation the investigators had uncovered. The hospital administrator who had accepted her payment faced her own separate charges and lost her medical licensing entirely. Desmond pursued civil action to recover the trust funds that had been wrongfully distributed to Sabrina over the years, money that I ultimately chose, once it was returned, to direct toward a foundation supporting families navigating adoption fraud and falsified birth records, because I could not build a life on money that had been stolen through my own erasure. But I could build something meaningful in the space that erasure had left behind. As for the relationship between Desmond and me, I want to be honest with you, because these stories always tempt you toward a fairy tale ending where a lost daughter and a grieving father embrace, and everything broken is instantly repaired. That is not how it happened, and I do not think that is how it happens for anyone living through something this large. Desmond was, in every biological sense, my father, but he was also a stranger, a man I had known for exactly one humiliating morning before learning the truth about who he was to me. We spent the better part of a year rebuilding something slow and careful between us. Dinners that started stiff and formal and gradually loosened into something closer to comfortable, long conversations about Vivian, about the mother I would never remember, about the 25 years we had both spent living lives the other knew nothing about. He met Mama and Curtis eventually, and I watched something soften in him when he shook Curtis's hand and thanked him, with real tears in his eyes, for raising me with the kind of love he had been robbed of the chance to give me himself. Mama and Desmond built an unlikely respect for each other over that first difficult dinner, two people who had each, in their own way, loved the same girl without ever knowing the other existed. I did not return to work at Callaway Vance Holdings, not because Desmond offered me a position out of guilt, though he did offer, several times, but because I needed to build my own footing before I could stand inside a company that carried my family's name. I finished my business degree, the one Curtis's illness had interrupted years earlier, using a portion of the recovered trust to cover what scholarships and loans could not. And I took a position with the Foundation Desmond, and I built together, working directly on adoption record reform, testifying twice before a state legislative committee about the gaps in oversight that had allowed a woman like Sabrina Whitlow to erase a living child from existence for the sake of an inheritance. It was strange, standing in front of lawmakers describing my own case as though it were a policy example rather than my entire life. But I understood by then that my story could either stay a private wound or become something useful to families who might otherwise face the same silence Mama and Curtis had faced 26 years earlier. I still carry that scar on my left wrist, the same crescent shape that once got me screamed at and fired within the same 5 minutes, and it means something entirely different to me now than it did before that Tuesday morning. It used to be a question mark, a small silver reminder of everything I did not know about myself. Now it is closer to a signature, proof that even when someone tries very hard to erase a person from the world for the sake of money, the body remembers what paperwork tries to forget. I think about Roland Pierce sometimes, the investor whose careless chair movement started Thai's entire unraveling, and I have to laugh a little at how strange life can be, that a man moving his chair back too quickly at the wrong moment ended up exposing a 25-year-old crime that a small army of lawyers and hospital administrators had worked very hard to keep buried forever. Desmond and I are not the kind of father and daughter you see in movies, finishing each other's sentences and speaking in easy affection built over decades. We are still learning each other, still finding our footing in a relationship that started with him screaming at me on a marble floor and ended with him discovering the daughter he had mourned for a quarter century. But we talk every week now. He calls me Iris sometimes, catching himself and correcting to Odessa because he says both names belong to me now, the girl he lost and the woman Mama and Curtis raised, and he refuses to make me choose between them. I have decided I do not want to choose either. I am Odessa Iris Marsh Calloway now, officially, on every piece of paper that matters, a name that finally tells the truth about where I came from and who loved me enough to keep me safe once I got there. There is one more evening I want to tell you about before I close this out, because I think it captures everything better than any single explanation could. About 4 months after the DNA results came back, Desmond invited me to the house he and Vivian had shared before the accident, a place he had kept exactly as it was for 25 years, unable to sell it and unable to fully live in it either, paying a caretaker to maintain the grounds while he lived instead in a downtown penthouse that felt more like a hotel suite than a home. He walked me through that house room by room, and in the room that had once been my nursery, still painted a soft yellow with a faded mobile of paper cranes hanging motionless above an empty crib. He showed me a small wooden box he had kept locked in his desk since the funeral. Inside it were things that had survived the wreckage: a single baby shoe, a hospital bracelet with the name Iris Calloway printed on faded plastic, and a photograph of Vivian holding me on the porch of that very house, taken only 3 weeks before the accident. I sat on the floor of that empty nursery holding a photograph of a mother I would never remember. And Desmond sat beside me, not saying anything for a long time, just letting both of us exist inside the strange, aching miracle of a story that had somehow found its way back to where it started. He told me that night that he had visited an empty grave every October for 25 years, standing in front of a headstone with my name carved into granite above nothing but soil and grief. He said the hardest part of learning I was alive was not the joy, though the joy was real and overwhelming, but the anger that came right behind it, anger at every wasted year, every birthday he had spent alone instead of watching me blow out candles, every ordinary Tuesday he could have had as my father if a woman he trusted had simply told the truth. I understood that anger because I felt a version of it myself, a grief for the childhood I never got to have with him, layered strangely on top of gratitude for the childhood Mama and Curtis had given me instead. Two griefs can occupy the same heart without canceling each other out, and I think that is the truest thing this whole experience taught me. People ask me sometimes if I forgive Sabrina Whitlow, and the honest answer is that forgiveness has not fully arrived yet, though I no longer carry the same burning need for her to suffer that I felt the day the investigators laid out the full timeline of what she had done. She took 25 years away from a grieving father and an entire childhood away from a little girl who deserved to grow up knowing where her pale hazel eyes came from. I do not know if I will ever fully release the weight of that theft, but I have learned something in the year since that coffee spilled across an imported marble table, something Mama used to tell me when I was small and heartbroken over things I did not yet have the language to explain. She used to say that the truth does not always arrive gently, but it always arrives complete, and once it does, you finally get to decide who you become on the other side of it. I became someone who refuses to be erased. I became someone who understands that the people who raise you and the people who made you are not always the same people, and both truths can live inside you without canceling each other out. I became someone who walks into rooms full of powerful men now, not as a temp worker carrying a coffee tray, but as a woman who has already survived losing herself once and rebuilding from nothing but a scar and a stubborn refusal to stay hidden. If you had told me a year ago that being fired over spilled coffee would lead me back to a father I never knew I had, I would have told you that sounded like something out of a movie, too strange and too neat to be real life. But real life, I have learned, is rarely neat. It is scars in unexpected shapes and truths buried under inheritance paperwork, and the strange mercy of a man moving his chair back at exactly the wrong moment. It is the whole complicated, painful, unbelievable shape of a life finally being told correctly after 25 years of being told wrong. If this story resonated with you, I would love to hear your thoughts. What would you have done if you had been in Odessa's place, standing on your knees in that conference room, watching a stranger's face go pale over an old scar? Would you have pulled your sleeve back down and walked away, or would you have stayed to hear the truth, even knowing it might break your whole world open? Share your perspective in the comments below, and if you enjoy thoughtful stories about family, betrayal, hidden truths, and second chances, please consider subscribing and joining us for the next journey.